Good evening. This is Shurmishta welcoming you to Reader's Retreat. Our story for today, All's Fair in Love and War by Jeffrey Archer. Jeffrey Archer, an English novelist and politician, his books have topped the bestseller lists around the world. He is a master storyteller and his writings are well known for plot twists. Today's story, All's Fair in Love and War by Jeffrey Archer. Ralph, pronounced Rafe Dudley Dawson, became squire of the village of Nethercote when his father died. After all, his father and grandfather had always been addressed as squire by the locals, and as he had inherited Nethercote Hall with its 1,000 acres of farmland and 10,000 sheep, he rather assumed that he would be treated with the same deference. So convinced was Rafe of his birthright, he refused to open letters that were not addressed to Rafe Dudley Dawson, Esq. Any friends Rafe had, of whom there were few, were either richer than he was or listed in Debrets, and like the royal family, he considered it nothing less than his duty to marry someone from his own class or preferably even higher. After all, Rafe was a good catch. The only problem for Rafe was that he did not come across too many young women living in the depths of Cornwall who fitted the bill. The Lord Lieutenant of the county, Sir Miles Simmer, had 3 daughters. Arabella was beautiful, Charlotte was charming, and Claire, who was neither, but inexplicably all 3 turned him down. The vicar's daughter, Maud, was a nice enough girl, but frankly he did not want to go into the garden with her. And in any case, she was about to disappear off to Lady Margaret Hall, which Rafe assumed was a nunnery. Once Rafe had attained his 40th year, he accepted that he might have to look further afield if he was to find anyone worthy of him, or at least that was until his eyes settled on Beth Trevelyan. Rafe, as the village squire, had been invited to present the prizes at a local swimming gala, and when Beth pulled herself out of the water, he could not take his eyes off her. He continued to stare at the apparition as he took off her swimming cap and shook out a mass of golden curls that fell to her shoulders, completing a picture that had all the young men and several of the older ones looking in her direction. Rafe was determined to add Beth to his many conquests, but as she passed by the judge's table, she did not give him a second look. Perhaps the 3-piece tweed suit, the brown suede brooch, and the half-hunter watch made him look a lot older than he was. He hung around outside the swimming pool, hoping to speak to the goddess, but when Beth finally appeared, dressed in a simple yellow frock, she was on the arm of a fair-haired, good-looking young man who Rafe thought he recognized, but could not place. It did not take Rafe long to discover that Jamie Kerrigan was a tenant farmer who rented 40 acres of his land and lived in one of the cottages on his estate, and that Beth was the daughter of a local publican who managed the Nethercote Arms, something else Rafe owned, but never frequented. What Rafe did not know until he had made some inquiries was the young sheep farmer had already approached Beth's father and asked for his daughter's hand in marriage. Mr. Trevelyan had not only agreed to the match but offered to hold the reception in his pub. Despite these setbacks, Rafe assumed that once Beth knew of his interest, she would not be able to resist his charms, as had been the case with several of the village girls? Not Beth, however, because when he invited her to tea at Nethercote Hall, she failed to reply. The young woman clearly did not know her place. As the weeks passed and several more invitations to tea, drinks, and even a trip to London were refused, Rafe was at a loss to understand her attitude, not least because he wasn't in the habit of being rejected. In desperation, he resorted to suggesting a weekend in Paris, only to be turned down once again. The weeks turned into months, and nothing he came up with seemed to interest her, which only caused Rafe to become more and more obsessed with the Cornish beauty until he could bear it no longer. He finally turned up at the Nethercote Arms unannounced and asked the publican for his daughter's hand in marriage. Mr. Trevelyan was left speechless until Rafe added a sweetener he felt confident would seal the bargain. Of course, Rafe had no intention of marrying the girl, but was determined to discover what it would be like to remove her 7 veils. However, Beth was not Salome, and in any case, she already knew the man she was going to spend the rest of her life with, and it certainly wasn't Ralph Dudley Dawson, Esq. Although her father had given Jamie his blessing, neither of them had taken into consideration Beth's mother, who, like any self-respecting barmaid, knew an opportunity when she saw one. On hearing the news of the squire's interest, Mrs. Trevelyan did not waste a moment, attempting to persuade, cajole, and even bully her daughter into accepting his proposal. However, Beth continued to resist her mother's blandishments until she discovered she was pregnant. When Beth informed her parents who the father was, her mother was quick to point out that Jamie Carrigan was a penniless shepherd who rented 40 acres of land and lived in a small cottage on the estate of a wealthy gentleman who wanted to marry her. However, Beth remained resolute in her determination to marry a lover until the squire failed to renew the 5-year lease on Jamie's 40 acres and also threatened to replace Mr. Trevelyan as landlord of the Nethercote Arms if his daughter did not accept his proposal. The hastily arranged marriage, Ralph could not wait, took place in a register office in Truro, and the reception was not held at Nethercote Hall for those in high places, but at the Nethercote Arms for a select few, as Rafe did not want his friends to realize he had married below his station. Mr. and Mrs. Dudley Dawson spent their honeymoon on the island of Rhodes, where there was little chance of them bumping into anyone they knew. When Rafe watched his wife undress for the first time, he was entranced by Beth's Botticelli figure, even more voluptuous than he had imagined, and when they finally made love, he was disappointed by her lack of enthusiasm and assumed it was simply because she was a shy virgin, and that, given time, Beth would come to enjoy his particular sexual fantasies. Not long after the newlyweds had returned to Nethercote, Beth announced she was pregnant. Rafe wasn't surprised. After all, they had not stopped making love during their honeymoon, 5 times a night. Rafe boasted to his friends, unaware that Beth was doing no more than carrying out her mother's instructions. 7 months later, Rupert Dudley Dawson entered the world, or at least that was the name that appeared on the birth certificate. Rafe showed no surprise at the premature birth, but did admit he was disappointed that young Rupert had not inherited the Dudley Dawsons' distinctive red hair and prominent nose. All in good time, he assured his friends, because like the royal family, Rafe would require an heir and a spare. Indeed, this mundane tale might not have advanced beyond the fate of a sad, unrequited woman and an overbearing, arrogant man had Germany not marched into Poland on 1st September 1939. Young Jamie Carrigan was among the first to report to the nearest recruiting office and sign up to serve his king and country with the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry. But then he had lost his one true love and sought an honourable death. Rafe, on the other hand, had no intention of joining up, and as he was over 40, he was exempt from conscription. So while Jamie went off to fight the king's enemies, Rafe took advantage of the government's voracious appetite for more food to feed the troops, which only made him grow richer, while his marriage became impoverished. Within a year of his marriage, the squire's eyes began to wander, and with so many of his countrymen serving on the front line, his choice became even wider. He told his chums that despite Beth's unquestionable beauty, a chap needed variety. Caviar was all very well, he had declared, but a fellow also needed the occasional dish of fish and chips. It wasn't long before Rafe began to ignore his wife, and the only joy left in Beth's life was young Rupert, who she feared was looking more like Jamie with each passing day. Every night she would fall on her knees and pray that her former lover would survive the war and return home safely. But the only news she heard of him came from those soldiers on leave, who, whenever Jamie's name was mentioned, repeated the words brave, fearless, and foolhardy. Beth began to fear she might never see him again. But then, like so many of his comrades, he was wounded on the battlefield and sent home to recover. When she first saw Jamie limping through the village on crutches, she immediately realized what a terrible mistake she had made. And it wasn't long before their dormant affair was rekindled. It would be wrong to describe what took place during the next 6 weeks as an affair, because they fell even more deeply in love the second time around. But when Beth once again became pregnant, she realized she would have to tell her husband the truth, not least because he would know that this time it could not be his child. Beth planned to tell him as soon as the doctor had confirmed she was with child, and would have done so when she returned home that afternoon, had the parlour maid not informed her that the squire had driven into Truro for an unscheduled meeting with his solicitor. Beth was relieved that Rafe must have somehow found out that she was pregnant and was well prepared to face the consequences, whatever wrath might be brought down on her. She sat alone in the drawing room, waiting for her husband to return so she could tell him the truth. If he refused to give her a divorce, Beth had already decided she would move out of the manor house and go and live with Jamie in his little cottage. But when Rafe returned several hours later, he marched into the house, slammed the front door, and disappeared into his study without a word passing between them. Beth sat alone for an hour until she could bear it no longer, and finally summoned up the courage to face him. She left the drawing room, walked slowly across the hall, and knocked quietly on his study door. "Come," said a terse voice. She entered the room shaking, and without even turning to face her, Rafe handed her what looked like a legal document. She read the letter twice before she realized what had made him so angry. It was a directive from the War Office requiring him to report to his local recruitment office, The summons pointed out that the call-up age had been extended from 41 to 51, and he was therefore now eligible to join the armed forces. The only choice they gave him was the army, the navy, or the air force. Beth decided this was not the time to let her husband know that she was pregnant. The following day, Rafe lost his temper with the family doctor when the damn man refused to sign a certificate citing his flat feet as a reason he should be exempt from war service. But Rafe did not give in quite that easily. He immediately wrote to the Ministry of Agriculture, pointing out the vital role he was playing in the war effort. However, an undersecretary made it clear by return of post that being a landowner did not qualify him for exemption. Undaunted, Rafe continued to search for any string he could pull to avoid being sent to the front line. He filled in applications for the Intelligence Corps, unqualified, the Navy, overstaffed, and the Home Guard, too young. After a month of fruitless delays, he finally accepted that he had no choice but to report to Officer Training School in Berkshire. 3 months later, he passed out of months as Second Lieutenant Ralph Dudley Dawson, ESQ, and was told to report back to his regimental headquarters in Truro, where he would receive his marching orders. Beth would have enjoyed Rafe's 3 months' absence if Jamie had not fully recovered, for which she felt partly to blame, and been ordered to return to his regiment. The difference was, this time he wanted to live. Before Jamie left, Beth wrote to her husband and told him that she would be seeking a divorce as soon as the war was over. He did not reply. On returning to Truro, the newly gazetted subaltern suggested to the commanding officer that his particular skills might be put to better use serving on the home front. However, as the colonel was unable to identify any such skills, Second Lieutenant Dudley Dawson was ordered to join the 5th Battalion of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry at Caen. That was when Rafe had his first stroke of luck. He was seconded to command headquarters behind Allied lines, where he quickly made some invaluable, as he did not intend to come face to face with the enemy if he could possibly avoid it. During her husband's absence, Beth wrote him a second letter, fearing he might not have received the first. But once again, Rafe did not reply. He assumed the affair would quickly fizzle out, and she would surely fall in line. After all, think what she would be giving up. Less than a mile away, serving on the front line, was Corporal Jamie Kerrigan, who had just been promoted and put in charge of his own section. As the regiment continued its advance towards the German border, Jamie was becoming more and more confident that the war was coming to an end, and it would not be too long before he would return to Nethercote, marry the woman he loved, and continue to farm his modest leasehold while Beth raised their children. Unfortunately, Rafe was also considering what he would do once the war was over and he had been demobbed. He had already decided not to extend the lease on Kerrigan's 40 acres when it came up for its annual renewal. He would give the man 30 days' notice and tell him to vacate the cottage and seek employment elsewhere. He also intended to renege on his agreement with Mr. Trevelyan to waive any future rent on the Nethercote Arms. After all, there was nothing in writing. Rafe assumed such threats would surely bring his wife to her senses. But even if she did not fall in line, he had no intention of divorcing her. It was after the colonel's morning meeting with his staff officers that he asked Captain Dudley Dawson to stay behind. "Rafe," said the commanding officer, once they were alone, "a problem had arisen, and I need you to deal with it discreetly. We have lost radio contact with the other battalion, and I need to urgently get a message to their commanding officer and let him know that I intend to advance at first light. Otherwise, I'll be stuck here until all communications are restored." "Understood, sir," said Dudley Dawson. "I can't pretend the assignment is not risky, and wonder if you can think of anyone who might be relied on to carry out such a dangerous mission." "I know just the man," said Dudley Dawson without hesitation. "Good. Then I'll leave all the details to you. Report back to me the moment your man returns." He hesitated. "Or doesn't." Captain Dudley Dawson left the colonel's tent, jumped into his jeep, and asked to be taken to the front line, which took his driver by surprise, as he had never been there before. On arrival, he immediately briefed Carrigan's section commander on the proposed mission. The young lieutenant was surprised by the colonel's choice of runner, remembering that the regiment's cross-country champion was also in his platoon. But he wasn't in the habit of questioning his commanding officer's orders. Rafe watched from a distance as Lieutenant Jackson briefed Carrigan on the importance of the assignment. A few minutes later, the corporal climbed out of the trench and, without looking back, set off across no man's land. "How long do you think it will take him to reach the other battalion?" asked Rafe after Jackson reported back to him. "If he makes it, sir, an hour at the most. But then he still has to get back." "Let's hope he does," said Rafe in his most sincere voice. Lieutenant Jackson nodded and said, "God help the man." Rafe did not believe in God, but decided he would hang around for a couple of hours or so before he reported back to the colonel that sadly Carrigan had not returned, and therefore the mission would have to be aborted. An hour passed, and there was no sign of Carrigan. Another 15 minutes, still no sign. But Rafe remained huddled in a corner of the trench for another half-hour before he allowed himself the suggestion of a smile. "Damned fine effort," he said to Lieutenant Jackson, who was peering through a pair of binoculars across the wooded landscape. "One could not have asked more of Carrigan," continued Rafe as he checked his watch. "Well, I would better get back to headquarters and let the colonel know that the advance will have to be delayed until we can make some radio contact." "Damn fine effort," he repeated. "I will be recommending to the colonel that Carrigan is awarded the military medal for service above and beyond the call of duty. It's the least he deserves," he added before he began to crawl along the trench. "Hang on, sir," said Lieutenant Jackson. "I think I can see someone in the distance." Rafe crawled back, fearing the worst. "He is about 100 yards away," added Jackson, "and heading straight for us." "Where?" said Rafe, leaping up and staring across the barren terrain. "Get down, sir," shouted the lieutenant, but he was too late, because the bullet hit Captain Ralph Dudley Dawson, ESQ, in the forehead, and he sank back down into the mud, just as Carrigan dived into the trench. The Duke of Cornwall's light infantry continued their advance towards Berlin at first light, while a coffin containing the body of Captain Dudley Dawson was shipped back to England, along with a letter of condolence from his commanding officer. The colonel was able to assure the grieving widow that her husband had sacrificed his life while serving his country on the front line. The 5th Battalion of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry won a great battle that day, and a year later, at a service held in Truro Cathedral, the name of Normandy was added to the regimental colours. Among those seated in the congregation was Corporal Jamie Kerrigan, MM, along with his wife and 2 children, Rupert and Susie. Unfortunately, Rafe Dudley Dawson, ESQ, had not considered the possibility of mortality and died intestate. His wife, being the next of kin, inherited a 1,000-acre estate, 10,000 sheep, Nethercote Hall, and all his other worldly goods. Jamie Kerrigan never thought of himself as the local squire, just a farm manager who had been lucky enough to marry the only woman he had ever loved. That was All's Fair in Love and War by Jeffrey Archer. This is Shormisha from Reader's Retreat once again. Please subscribe my channel for notification updates and more stories. We'll be back with a new story soon. Until then, thank you and good night.